if you're aware of that conflict between how you see yourself and how others see you, you have to make a choice of how you then bring those two versions together and present what is known about you by others.
Try to take down the story of the people or actually engage you with them. I'm imagining now that you're talking with the executive of businesses or organization, because I can see that you are entering into their mind, into their heart, connecting with them one-on-one, not just with statistics now and data, but with story, emotion. Tell me, what story element do you employ that you find effective in your case?
Know what your values are, what your core principles are, where your boundaries. Know how flexible those boundaries are so that you could coexist in the world.
Hi, and thank you for checking out Obehi Podcast. We encourage people to own their story and share it with the world to expand their purpose. Before we start this presentation, I have something to quickly share with you. Are you a purpose-driven entrepreneur? Do you want to cut across the noise and attract your ideal client by leveraging your own story? Then pay attention. I have a signature program that can help you own your story. A 5-step transformative journey to reshape your professional and business narrative for success in less than 90 days. And it's available at academy.aclasses.org/story. This is what we have understood. Storytelling is the most powerful instrument known to man. And this is what that could mean to you. You can either own your story and use it to advance your purpose in your business and professional life, or someone else will do. The choice is yours. Now let's get started with today's episode of the Obehi Podcast.
Hi everyone, my name is Antonia Ferrier. I am from the beautiful Caribbean islands of Trinidad and Tobago, specifically Trinidad. And I work as a consultant, a coach, and trainer. And broadly, I like to say strategy and performance. But it's really about growth and finding the best possible options for yourself, whether you're looking at it from the perspective of you personally or the organization.
All right, that's interesting, Antonia. Now, tell me first, Tim. So you were born in Trinidad and Tobago now. That should be a few years ago, right? So tell me, what do you see around you growing up as a young adolescent in Trinidad and Tobago?
As an adolescent, yes, a lot of change. I actually had an interesting conversation with my nephew yesterday. I'm currently visiting my mom up in the US and, getting my devices reconnected to the Wi-Fi. We couldn't figure it out. And my nephew, who is also visiting, he said, "You millennials don't know technology." And I said, "Oh, we're not a millennial." And he was shocked. So yes, I can see where you get the confusion. But I'm Gen Xer. I'm 53 years old and I have been working 30 years. So I always say I was very fortunate to have come in at the cusp of technology change. I speak both languages. He didn't understand what I meant when I said that. So I said I started off in the analog world. I went to electronic and got into digital. So I've seen a lot of change. In my home country, I grew up at the time in the 70s where Black Power started, that radically transformed my society. And by the time I entered the workplace, I didn't have a lot of challenges that my mother and her generation would have experienced in terms of being female, in terms of being Black entering the workplace. And a lot of my own experience occurred at a time of great affluence in my society as well. So I have some interesting perspectives on life and how you grow as a person and as an organization that are not bound by a lot of the stuff that you see taking place in other societies. And it's been an interesting journey as I started to travel the world, and how fortunate I am to be a Trinidadian. Like I said, very much unbound by a lot of definitions of what I should be, that I think really allowed me to get a world view that easily fits in wherever I go. And so the only boundary that I have is where others try to pigeonhole me. And the only challenge I have is if I refuse to sit in that pigeonhole because I don't identify with what you think I should.
Explain that to me. What do you mean people try to pigeonhole you? What does that mean? Explain.
So I think I first really noticed it when I started to travel, particularly in the US. When phenotypically and at your first glance, how would you describe me?
Well, I would describe you as an African diaspora, as a person of African descent living outside of Africa. Of
Right.
course, it then depends on you for how many generations you want to go with that. But that would be my first interpretation.
That's here, right? When I land in the US, I appear Black. But when I open my mouth, I'm no longer Black. I'm an immigrant, and I've actually had, depending on what type of American I'm talking to, I'm described differently. So I've actually had white people tell me I'm not Black. And I said, so what am I? And I remember one guy telling me, and he's from the deep South, telling me, you're tan. So I make a joke now that I am actually caramel because that's the color makeup that I wear. And over time, I've turned into Tuffy. But I'm not Black in the US because I am not African American. And how they treat me is very different from how they would treat somebody who was born Black in the US. And so over time, and I think one of the things that really struck me was when I visited the African American Museum in the US, in DC, and I looked at their history of slavery, their version of the African diaspora. And the way it evolved was very different in the US than how it evolved in the Caribbean. And I know within the Caribbean, even depending on who came to the Caribbean, your sense of worth, your sense of value, and where you place yourself in society varies. So I put it off, it depends who you are as a Black person, and in the African diaspora, depends on which part the boat drops you off when you're in the West. And so one of the biggest differences between me, how I identify as Black, versus in the US is I am not a minority. I've never been a minority. In my country, the people who rule, the people who take charge, the people who have money look like me. That's the society I grew up in. A few generations before me, all the wealthy classes would have been purely white. And we would have been slaves and we would have been looked down upon. But like I said, I was born at the time of revolution, of the Black Power movement, when Black became beautiful. So my sense of worth is very different. So when you try to pigeonhole me and say, well, you're supposed to stay in your place, stay in the background, be deferential, I don't act like that. I don't accept being treated like that. And it gets me in trouble, particularly in airports, but it's like I said, I think how you identify and how others identify you varies depending on the perspective that you come from, and what you think about not just race, but also class structure. In Trinidad, we had what appeared in the 90s. I remember with we had the peak of my youth going out to nightclubs, and there were a few nightclubs where you would not be let in, and it appeared to be manifesting as race. But in our society, race overlaps a lot with class, and so it was really a class struggle and not a race struggle. So how we resolved it was very different from how another society would have resolved it, and in fact, those clubs that had those restrictions about who could enter on what night actually closed down over time because the society would not allow it. Because, as I said, the overlap with class meant that the people who had money was not necessarily white only. Or in our society, we have a high percentage of the population, almost half the population is also of East Indian descent, and they too have a lot of wealth. So the non-white population is like about, when I was born, it was like 4%. Now it's about 1% because we have a lot of mixed race people like myself, which take up a significant proportion of the society as well. So when those two identities of race and class overlap, it really comes down to who holds the wealth, who holds the power in the society. And so it wasn't allowed to play out by us. It was shut down.
All right. Now you see people defining you, describing you based on what they see.
Yes.
But how do you describe yourself? How do you describe how do you describe yourself, Antonia?
I think it depends on which identity you lead with. I am female. For some people, I am Black. If I'm in a foreign country, I'm a foreigner. I could be an immigrant. I could be young. Not so much anymore, but some people still see me as young.
Which is not a bad thing,
Not a bad thing. Like I said, I hope I'm gracefully aging. But I think it really, I think if you have awareness of that identity is not made up of one thing, and you are conscious of what I call othering, which is that who you appear to be is just a version perceived by somebody else. And that's how you get treated, because people are going to treat you how they see you. If you're aware of that conflict between how you see yourself and how others see you, you have to make a choice of how you then bring those two versions together and present what is known about you by others. And so you get to self-select. But if you are not conscious of that multiplicity of views, then I think more often than not, you get treated as others see you. And if you accept that behavior, then that's what you become. And so I try to walk that fine line of first understanding how I'm being perceived by the other person, and reconciling that with how I want to be seen before I choose how to present myself. There are some instances where gender is important, and therefore I lead as a female. Most of the times, though, I personally choose to present myself void of gender and race, and I have the luxury of doing that in my society. So I'm just an intelligent person.
Thank you so much for that. I like the way the conversation is rolling out. The different dynamics that are coming into it is really making it very rich. Yes, of course, this is not really about identity today, even though identity is a big part of the work that I do, because I am mainly concentrating on people of African descent. And
Yes.
based on what have happened to us, identity is a very important conversation.
Yes.
I remember a couple of years ago, I wrote a book that I titled Crisis of Identity.
Yes.
In that book, which of course, that is what I'm showing you here. That is in my website. So at the point, I was saying in that book, how do you even define an identity? Because now, of course, making an example of myself, I said, I am in Nigeria. Nigeria is in Africa, which means I'm also an African.
Yes.
I am a man, but I'm also a husband.
Right.
I am a father,
Yes.
and I'm also an immigrant because I live in Italy.
Right.
I am a worker, which
Yes.
means because I'm working, then I have colleagues and all of that. Of course, I could go on and on and on and on to say, all these are me, all these are who I am.
Yes.
Then, of course, I followed by saying, how simple, therefore, is it to even describe identity? Because if we want to
Yes.
talk about identity crisis, we first of all need to start by what is even identity.
Yes.
So, because that argument or that topic come up in your description just now, how would you describe identity for somebody who is sort of curious? Tell me something about that. Of course, we move into what you do just now.
I think we use the word now, your brand, which gives a sense of what you're known for. And how you appear. So there's the physical aspect and there's the behavioral aspect. And I think there's the results aspect, because how you interact with people has a result and impact on others and the world. And that's what I think you become known for. And so your image, your physical image, your personality, and behaviors you display combine to give you an identity. And that is true whether or not you're a person or a corporation. Because I don't think people realize organizations have personalities too.
Yeah, that's very important. No, all what you are saying are very important because since we are very heavy here on storytelling, and most of the people that we work with, particularly within the area of business and business storytelling, are businesses that are result oriented, that are purpose driven.
Yes.
If that is the case, then identity is going to come at a point. In fact, there is a signature program that I'm developing now. It's not yet ready, but it will be ready soon. It's called Own Your Story. It's
Yes.
entirely predicated on the idea that as an entrepreneur, you need to own your story and use it to attract the right audience.
Yes.
Now, when you tell your story, like I often say to businesses or business owner, you expose yourself. And when you expose yourself by the part of telling your story, some people will go away from you. And that is a good thing because that is not your tribe. Because
Yes.
you are not serving everybody. But your
Yes.
story is eventually going to resonate with some people. That is the only
That's,
people you really want.
yes.
Which means that you need to own that story and
Yes.
own everything that come along with it.
Yes.
So yeah, the question of identity really is important because people at the point need to ask, but who are you? Even if you were a business also need to have an identity, need to know where you are in the scheme of things.
Yes.
What do you say about that? Because we are moving into your coaching just now.
Yes. Interestingly, I do something similar, but more adaptive, for want of a better term, in that when, from an organization perspective, particularly when we talk about communication, I always start with the premise of telling me, what is the story you want to tell? And interestingly, I use storytelling as my main motive for communication. And I think it is an inheritance from our African descendants. We are oral societies. I grew up in an oral society, and whether we tell stories in words or in music, I think if you there's a richness to the way we communicate when you think of it as a story and not just as words on a paper or images on a screen. So I think patience, when you start putting yourself out, if you are cognizant that the organization itself has a personality, if you start with that premise of what is the story we want to tell, then it brings, I think, a connection to your purpose and your meaning, because it gets over that, what I call the othering of somebody else defining you. If you start with the story that you want to tell, then you become more conscious of your image, of the personality, the behaviors, and how those connect to the result that you want, which is the impact you want on the world. And that consciousness really starts honing in the language that you use, the colors that you use. We always talk about the reception test when you walk into any office, any company. What are the first things that you see? Because that is how the world is going to judge you. So if you don't begin very, very assertively with that story that you want to tell, you could probably have a bare office, some broken furniture, an unfriendly receptionist that does not align with the vision of you as an organization that you want the world to see. If you're conscious about it, then you're going to pay attention to who sits at the front desk, because that's the first voice and face that people see, and how well it represents your story and your image, and of course how you decorate the entryway. And it transcends again into how you treat your staff. Yes, the work environment you create for them, the rules you create for them, and as we get into the story of rules, maybe we're getting a little too deep at this point, but the other thing you need to be conscious of in terms of defining your identity is to be aware that what you put on paper is not actually what evolves into your corporate identity and your corporate culture. It's the way people interpret that and blend that with their own perception of the world and their own norms and their own concerns. And so the informal culture is really what the world sees, because that's the people don't organize, interact with the organization, they interact with the people in the organization. And so if those people don't have a common view of what this organization represents, you're going to get their loose interpretation or a wrong interpretation. You have the employees who have no problem griping about you and making it clear they hate working where they work. And so the organization becomes known as a place where people hate to work.
That's interesting. All right, now tell me something, Antonia. How did you get into coaching? That is important for us, and of course, that is part of the story, but that is also your work. Tell me how you got into coaching.
Interestingly enough, I think I naturally adapted to it. When I was doing my first degree, I did a sociology and management combination at a time when we were doing the University of the West Indies in Trinidad. The sociology department had a heavy bias towards anthropology. So there was a lot of discussion and teaching around cultures and the shaping of cultures. And I really, when I blended that with one of my electives, which was human resource management and specifically organization development, I really got into this deep, I made this deep connection between my sociology, my favorite school of thought, ethnology, which looked at the formulation of meaning in society, and the shaping of cultures, where you bring all these different meanings to find the normative, which is my other school of thought, the functionalism school. How do we create a norm that people can more or less buy in, that this is who we are? And I recognized in looking at organization development and the practice of it, that there were different styles, so you could be very prescriptive and you tell people what to do, or you could be facilitative, where you assume that they know what to do, but you're encouraging them to speak. As you say, tell your own story. And I had an affinity for that style. Years on, I was reapplying to do my master's, and one of the VPs put down that I was a good coach. And I said, "Oh, you mean you coach me?" And she said, "No, you're an excellent coach." And now I didn't think of myself in that way, but I went with it, and I started looking. Well, I evolved as somebody who advised management. Um, I I got very much into influence and decision making among executives just by the nature of the work that I did. And somebody that they would, when you have a problem, you call. And because I am not an executive, I'm very conscious of that. I made sure that I stayed in that facilitative type of mood where I would just ask you questions as to, well, what are you trying to do? Why are you trying to do that? Help you come to the point of finding your purpose, your meaning, and the end outcomes and results that you wanted, and helping you make the decisions, as opposed to going in to tell you what to do. Yeah, because from my perspective, at the end of the day, as an executive, you have to own your decision. So if I imposed my thinking on it, or pushed you to make a decision that I thought was best, I don't think I was helping you as an executive make the right decision, because you can own it. You're uncomfortable with it. So my rationale was to help. I thought I was just influencing the decision. So later on, I was doing a master's in business psychology. One of the courses was, of course, coaching. And I recognized, I said, hey, this is an area that I can work in fully and officially. So I really got into that. But I think the tipping point for me to really lean heavily into coaching was during COVID. I happened to be working on, for my own personal development, emotional intelligence. And so I had just come back from doing the first two courses in becoming more emotionally intelligent, and being a practitioner of emotional intelligence. And I think the week we landed is the week the border closed, thanks to COVID. And I was stuck. I had a crisis of identity, because at the time I was planning to be, I had just started my own practice, and I was planning to be this big strategy consultant. I had landed my first big $1 million contract, and I thought I was set. I looked for no other work. So I said I would go do my course, get myself, some new skills, because I truly believe that in the 20th century, this issue of emotional intelligence was not recognized as critical to success in life. It wasn't taught well. It wasn't incorporated as a critical skill. And just to digress a little bit, I think in the 21st century, if you cannot use your emotional intelligence and leverage it as part of your wheelhouse, you're going to fail, whether as an individual or as an executive. But back to my story. So here I am stuck, and now I don't know what I'm going to do. The contract I had landed was, in fact, in another country. So I couldn't go to that because the borders were closed. Because it was a long project, I had no other work lined up, and I was like, what am I going to do? Who do I become? How am I going to get income? I was having trouble coping, and it so happened that the organization I was doing emotional intelligence with, the 6 Seconds community, we were putting out these nice little feelers, and there was one little mini video about optimism and hope. And that got me to center myself at the beginning of COVID when we knew nothing and everybody was in a state of panic. That, if I am having problems coping, and not to be immodest, but I have an above average intelligence and an array of skills, and ability to rationalize stuff, and find solutions very easily, or I should say faster than average. And I said, if I was having a challenge, what are other people doing? And that really pushed me to go and certify myself in emotional intelligence and coaching, because I was trained but not certified. And professionally, people like to see the letters behind. Not that it impeded me. I don't need the letters. I've never needed letters to do what I have to do. But like I said, that is what really pushed me to really expand my coaching beyond when I'm working with an executive team doing their strategy.
I like what you said, that your VP at the time said that you're a good coach, even though you really haven't started doing the work of coaching formally, but you perhaps have been doing it informally without you even knowing that. Why do you
Yes.
think he or she said that?
I think it's really because of the role I played in helping them make decisions. And I think that is what coaching is. That's how I define it. It's really creating the environment and the conditions to help an individual make the best possible decisions for them by themselves. But you don't have to be alone in that process. So when I say by yourself, it means there's nobody telling you what to do. The role of the coach is really to help you navigate and see things that you might be missing. And it's like I said, it's not a telling function. It's a supporting function. So it's to help the person see what they're not seeing, take off the blinders a bit, and have a broader awareness. So if you're being an effective coach, you know how to ask certain questions, how to probe, how to give them insight as to what they're doing. But I think most importantly, if you are a good coach and an effective one, what you do is you remove the fear of decision making. My whole business is centered around what I call decision making. When I was starting it, I had to ask myself, what do I do best? Because I'm good at a lot of stuff. I'm not going to lie. And I don't mean to sound immodest, but I am very good at a lot of stuff. I'm a very good analyst. I'm a good writer. I'm a good speaker. But when I looked at the 30 years that I had worked up to that point, and where I felt impactful, it was in fact coaching executives, helping them make decisions. And so my business, which is called Definitive Management Solutions, is based on the premise that when I get you to the point of making the decision as a executive organization, as the president or the CEO, that is the decision for the organization. It becomes the organization. So it's definitive. That's the story of my corporate brand, by the way. But that's how I came about it. I started with what do I do well and how do I impact the world? And, that led me there. And so I think that particular VP was very, very pleased, because I remember when she got promoted, a lot of people thought she was not ready for the position, including the organization. And they actually sent her for training to help her raise her emotional intelligence and her ability to manage conflict and be a little more assertive. So they recognized her technical talent, but they were less confident that she had the personality to lead. And so she appreciated the support that I gave her in terms of whenever she had a challenge, whether it was based on data or just people management. that I added value to her the process of making those decisions, clarify what she was thinking, identifying what information she would need or what data she would need to to be sure of of delivering on the result that she wanted. And I think a lot the premise for my business is that people have, it's not that people don't know what they want to do, it's that they're afraid to do it. We are risk averse. We don't want to look bad, particularly if you're sitting in an executive position or you're in charge of billions of dollars, and a mistake could tank the company. It's very easy for you to lack the confidence to move forward, and that's why you see so many people step back and let the loud talker go, so you can hide behind, fly under the radar, as the saying goes, because they don't want the risk of a bad outcome. My way of getting around that, just to carry the conversation forward, has always been to think of what could go wrong first. If you are sure that your idea is a good idea, I think you should have the confidence to go forward with it. But you always have to have a plan and an exit strategy, because the reality is, even though you are sure and you are confident that is a good idea, it doesn't mean the world is ready to accept it. Timing is everything. Resource availability is another thing. And those are not things that you have control over. Plus, you have all the interference from other people who may be competing against you, either as a person or as an organization, that will do things to sabotage you. Or you may be talked, particularly when you're a female executive, you could be talked over by males, or I'm sure a lot of your audience would have experienced this, where gender or race interferes, yes? And there's a perception that you're not as good as the others. And so you present the idea and it's not accepted, and somebody says the same thing and it's accepted because that person is seen as knowledgeable or more knowledgeable than you. I'm sure you must have experienced that at some point in your life.
It's part of life.
Yeah.
But you also made mention of something that I think it is important, and I think it is reflected in your work, which is strategy. I think you are referred to yourself as strategic consultant. What does that mean? Tell me the role of strategy in what you do.
I think strategy broadly is something that gets confused. People think of it as some people think of it as just tactics, doing things, and some people think of it just a document. And so the field of strategy management is relatively new, came out of the US Army. The version that we know that is taught originated from the US Army, and it translated into the business world, as in, how do we get ourselves as an organization from point A to point B? Yes. And what are the moving parts that we need to bring together to get to that end point? Now, I don't think a lot of organizations actually practice strategy. I don't think, this is my experience, so it could be limited to my world. I don't think we have a lot of people who are naturally strategic thinkers, and people who are trained to think strategically, because you can't be trained to think strategically if you're not natural. But I don't think it's something that's done as a priority, and we seem to think that it could happen just like that in an organization. In my society, a lot of organizations are family owned. And so it may have started off with somebody who who had a great idea and the resources to make it happen. And so, but they did it on their own from an entrepreneurial perspective. And then they brought along others with them, but they never incorporated those people into the decision-making process. So it's like, well, I own a company, so if this is what I want to do, that's what happens. In tribal societies, I think a lot of it happens like that too, yes? The chief says, jump, and the rest of the tribe says, how high, right? We don't have, I don't think we have inherently a culture of inclusive decision making. So it's just a person, and a person who might be influenced by others tend to do the decision making as to how do we grow. But for me, strategy is essentially that. What is our story of how do we grow, and how do we present that in real life? So think of it as a staged, a well-managed stage play that has a beginning and an end point, and stories that are told in between. So you really have to plot out the scenes and figure out who the actors are, and what's the music you need, what's the lighting you need to make yourself shine on the world stage. Yeah. For me, strategy succeeds on two bases: that you have proper thinking and decision making about it, that it gets documented in some way, but most importantly, that once you figure out the big idea of who do we want to be in the future, and you understand who you are now, and you figure out how the story has to evolve from who we are now to who we want to be in the future, which is your current mission and your vision. Yes, the 2 points of strategy. If you don't have a plan that engages others in that story, to write that story, you're going to fail. And a lot of the times what I see is people have the big strategy, like the outline of the story, but they don't have the details, which is the plan part. And even when they have the plan part, the plan may have been written by the wrong people. And so when it comes down to execution, you have an execution failure because people don't buy the story. They have no part in writing that story. Yes? They can't relate to it. And so they may not go along. And when people don't go along with the story that you want to tell, you get that dissonance. You get misaligned execution. You get people's personal agendas and private agendas interlooping. You make yourself open to opposition and sabotage from the outside world. And most importantly, you lack the ability to present a united front where everybody's singing the same song, telling the same story, so that the rest of the world sees this is who we are becoming. And so when you don't have proper execution management, you fail as well, because again, it's the stories that we tell. You have to bring people along when you want to change a story. You have to get their cooperation, because every story has a role. So right now, if this is who we are, I know what my role is. My role is simply to show up and write on a piece of paper. But if the story that I want to change that story to say that I am highly automated and efficient, it means that my role has to change from somebody who shows up and writes paper to somebody who shows up and does something else. It might be on a computer, or it might be doing something very, very different from what I was. And I think this is where we come back to that issue of identity, because in the organization, every person has an identity that's attached to their job. And if you particularly if you have a radical strategy or the world requires you to make a significant change. If the new story has rules that conflicts with your current rule, your current identity, a lot of people can't make the transition. And I think that's where I come in professionally, to help people understand their stories, and not just the big story of the organization, but all the small stories inside the organization, your personal stories. When I work with an executive team, one of the first things I do is to get them to tell me the story of the organization, although they're not aware that's what I'm doing. And I start with a very simple question, which is, how are you? And people go crazy when I do that, because they don't see the purpose of it, because they say, I'm here to talk strategy, and this is not strategy. But strategy cannot be executed without people, no matter how well written it is. And if the people are not buying into that story that's written, they're not going to know what roles they have to play. And so the first thing I try to take a sense of is, how comfortable are you right now with your current story, with your current role, and how it interplays with the other stories in the organization. And that question of how are you brings out so much rich information, and all the many stories about the stress level, the balance between their role at work and their role at home, those identities, how they're combining. I've seen people break down in tears with that, once they start talking about how are you. And that gives me a gauge as to how easy it's going to be for me to help them change their story. Because if they are in a dysfunctional, toxic quagmire of stories where everybody is fighting, the individuals are in conflict, it means that getting them to a point where they can agree that this is a new story we're going to tell, and these are the changes we have to make individually, it's not going to be an easy journey. And so you have to gauge that first. And I think when it comes down to strategy, that's where it lies, understanding the people,
You're right.
their stories.
Talking about that moment that you are trying to take down the story of the people or actually engage you with them, I'm imagining now that you are talking with the executive of businesses or organization. Tell me what story element you use to be able to help them to talk, because I can see that you are entering into their mind, into their heart, so that they can, you are really connecting with them one-on-one, not just with statistics now and data, but with story, emotion. Tell me, what story element do you employ that you find effective in your case?
I think I like asking you to imagine if you were something. Yes, imagery I think helps. So I might say, if you were a plant, what kind of plant would you be? If you were an animal, what kind of animal would you be and why? And I think that mechanism allows people to step outside of themselves and other themselves. Yes, it's very hard. I see it all the time with myself. When you ask me to describe me, how I describe me is terrible. I'm a very, very poor describer of myself. And I think a lot of people are challenged if you ask them to stay from the inside and describe themselves. Because you have to go through all the fears and concerns and biases that create these mental models that filter how we present ourselves, because we always want to present our best self. Yes. And so if you start from the inside out, sometimes people are challenged if they are not inherently super confident about their self description and self-worth. You're going to get a lot of filters that modulate that image. However, if you take them out and you get them to describe from the outside in, from something that is safe, which is an inanimate object, I think, or well, a creature, um, but not themselves, they are better able to give you some insight as to who they really are in terms of their characteristics and their traits and concerns.
How did you come up with that approach? How did you test that and you say, okay, this is the approach to use? Tell me about the origin of that.
Like I said, I grew up in an oral society. And so I was well versed with storytelling, and that influence of etymology with the creation of meaning, I think influenced me to lean to that style. And I mean, we grew up, I don't know if you're familiar with the Anansi stories, Anansi the Spider-Man and Aesop fables, where we speak to the human condition, not from a human perspective, but observing the behavior of animals. Yes. I think there's a comfort in that. That makes it easy to relate stories through. It removes some of the emotionality from when we look at people imagery. So I think that's why I prefer that style. Just it gives you a place of safety and comfort to talk about highly personal stuff without feeling as though you're exposed to the world. It's like putting on the mask, which is what identity is, huh?
You see, I told you in the beginning that it was going to be an important point in the conversation. And really, it is an important point in the conversation. Whether you are looking at a business environment or looking at a community environment or looking at a personal environment, identity is always an important part of the conversation, particularly when we are using storytelling, like in this case now.
Yes.
Yeah. So tell me, Antonia, what is the importance of storytelling in business or in the work that you do as a strategic consultant?
Well, like I said, at the end of the world, at the end of the day, it's the brand. People interact with a perception of you. And so you get to define that. If you take charge of that, it means you do get to put out your best self as opposed to letting people define it for you.
Actually, I have an important point I wanted to ask there is if there is an intrinsic reason why storytelling works in business, because now what we are doing in the classes media and also in Obehi Podcast, this podcast, is that we are encouraging people to use storytelling in their business because we found it to be the most powerful instrument that we can use because it helps us to be able to differentiate ourselves. The other day, I was researching, then I found out that since the existence of human being on Earth, there have been about 170 billion people that have walked the surface of the Earth. And when you look at that from the point of view of storytelling or story, you can actually say now that each of these 117 billion people is a unicorn. Each of us is unique. And what is unique about us are our experiences, the life that we have lived, and the story that we're able to build around that. But of course, unfortunately, many people do not know how to tell this story or do not know that their story is even important. So that, like Les Brown would say, many people will disappear from this earth the same way that they come without any trace. So because it is very, very, very important that we understand our role in this world and in our society and in our businesses, and therefore our story, which is our face, our voice, I think it is important that we continue to elevate this part. So the question, therefore, for you is, why do you think people should leverage the power of storytelling in business from your experience?
So that brings us back to what I was saying in the beginning about it's your brand. Yes, it's the story that you want to tell about yourself. And from a business perspective and a strategic perspective, as you said, everybody has a unique point. And it is that uniqueness that gives you a competitive advantage. And so if you don't understand what is unique about you, what is unique about your story, and you're unable to communicate that to the rest of the world, in what you portray, whether it's your ads, whether it's your presentations, whether it's the words, the messages, that the sub stories that your employees tell. If you are not able to define that and get that embedded as this is who we are, you're going to fail, because there's no way for you to differentiate yourself, particularly in today's world. Long before we got into artificial intelligence, just the impact of technology homogenized the world. So we have standardized processes because it's tied to technology that requires things to go in a specific pattern. We don't have the ability for randomness that we once had. And so making yourself stand, and everybody has access to it now. So you don't, even if you have a unique story, a unique product, it's very easy for people to replicate it. If you think of mobile phones, yeah. And so what differentiates an iPhone from a Samsung Note, right? Or back in the day, the BlackBerry. It was the unique selling point, the USP, that allowed people to experience the product and to some extent the organization, because there was a story that they had an affinity to. And so with the Apple went with, this innovation of how do I want to experience the world through technology. Yeah. And so if you see yourself as cutting edge and trying new things, you would buy into that story. If you see yourself as absolutely secure and safe and secretive, back in the day you would have gone with a BlackBerry instead of the iPhone, because of the security story that went with the technology that was BlackBerry. Okay? When people stopped caring about security and they more were concerned about image and wealth and personal style, then BlackBerry lost its meaning and value in the market, and it went away. Yeah, because they stuck with their story of security and a secure platform and did not innovate or try to replicate the new technology that was coming from ease of use and style and fashion, like Samsung and Apple, and they lost their market totally. They've never recovered, even when they introduced their swipe phones. Have you ever used a BlackBerry stripe phone? No. A lot of people don't even know what a BlackBerry is. A lot of providers, mobile providers, absolutely refuse to have anything to do with BlackBerry now. They never caught up because they stuck with that story and didn't change it. And so it is finding that unique point, and telling the story around that unique point and finding the people who have an affinity to it that gives you your competitive advantage and your strength. And so, like, this is why when I work with organizations, I always start off with, what is the story you want to tell? Why do you want to tell that story, and to whom? Because once you have those three fundamental stories, you have your perspective already set down, but it gives you the bridge to tell that story in a way, not from how you see it, but how they are going to see it. I hope
The
that's
story
clear.
you want to tell, but that is really powerful. You see, I was reading an article a couple of months ago, actually, because I was doing a research about story. And somebody make reference to BlackBerry and, of course, the rise of Apple coming to dominate the telephone market. And the article
Yes,
says that BlackBerry was actually more superior to Apple as of the time,
yes,
but Apple
yes.
just had better story, which is to say now that, you see, this is why we believe that story, actually, what I say here is that it's not that storytelling is one of the most powerful instruments I said storytelling is the most powerful instrument that we have as
It
humanity.
is.
Because with
Yes.
storytelling, we can literally move a mountain. We just move the mountain entirely and put it to another place and sit it there. If there is a
Yes.
valley, we can fill it up and pass through it. Because story help us to boil a hole in the mountain and make a road to cross across it. With story,
Absolutely.
there is nothing we cannot do.
Just to stick with that contrast in stories, to really bring it home, if we go back to that apple and analogy, the story around BlackBerry was very corporate and limited and exclusive. I remember my first BlackBerry. I got it when I started working as the assistant to the president in my company. And I asked him, "Well, what do you want me to do?" He said, "Just get a BlackBerry." That's all. The only instruction I had. And when I went to get it, um, the the department that was responsible for the manager, she was like, "You can't get that. You're just an assistant. This is exclusive for board members." I said, "But you have 20 extra Blackberries with nobody using them." She said, "Yes, but that's just in case the director loses their phone. We have a replacement." I said, "Well, I don't think if you have 20 extra Blackberries sitting down and of the 7 board members, one loses the phone, giving me a BlackBerry is going to impact your ability to give them a replacement." But the real issue was that access to the BlackBerry was exclusive. And here I was, she was a manager, she didn't have one. So it was only the VPs, the president, and the board members had Blackberries at the time. And so giving me that BlackBerry was giving me access to privilege and power that she did not have, even though she was senior to me. And so that created a lot of issues. With the iPhone, the iPhone story was more mass market, yes? And it was more aspirational. Anybody could own an iPhone if they wanted to, as opposed to you having, because when BlackBerry was introduced, it was introduced at a high level in the organization. So the companies had to get it. I mean, eventually they tried to get broad market appeal, but a lot of the functionality that made BlackBerry great, you couldn't really get it if you weren't part of that clique. You understand? Whereas the Apple and iPhone, you didn't have to belong to a specific place to get the value out of it. You could get it on your own. You could access it once you could afford it. And people like to be able to say they could afford stuff. And so that is where that appeal came from. That I was yes, I was part of an exclusive club, but it was one that I could put myself into, as opposed to the BlackBerry Club, where really I had to be at a certain level in an organization to make it work. So I think part of the story, when you think about the story you want to tell, and that question about who you want to tell it to becomes very, very important, because now you're looking at how big is my market? How big is my reach? Do I tell a story that appeals to anybody, anywhere, anytime, any place? Or do I want to go after a very specific niche? And can that niche give me the returns that I need to grow my organization? If you don't think about that in terms of, okay, once I reach my target audience, what is it going to do for me? You're going to make the wrong decision, I think. And so it's very, very important to spend some time to think about who really am I telling that story to? And then say it, as I said, how would they need to hear the story for them to believe?
Thank you so much for that. Another thing that I would like you to spend some time on is the performance coaching. I think that is also an area that you are really living on, no? Or that you are heavy on.
Yes.
Could you tell us something about that? What is performance coaching, and how do you approach it in your business?
We like to think that if I pay you, and we tend to think, if I want you to do more work, I need to give you more resources or more reasons to do it than not to do it. So we will either try to incentivize you by giving you a bonus or cash or some other privilege if you do well, or disincentivize you from not performing by making it very difficult for you. You're put in a space of fear. Yes? If I don't do well, I'm going to lose whatever I have in terms of my job or my salary. There's a penalty, or I get sidelined or ostracized by my team or my manager. One of the things, and I think I call it a misstep in thinking, because and partly ignorance, because we just didn't know it at the time, was that the way we designed organizations and the way we drove performance in organizations was is counter to how the brain receives information. And I think personally, the best thing I did for myself was to go back to school to do that business psychology degree, because it exposed me to the thinking of how the brain functions, because it was neuroscience based. And neuroscience has reshaped radically our understanding of the world. You would have seen how marketing has radically changed over time, the kinds of ads, and because they're leveraging how the brain interprets information. And in organizations, more often than not, we lean to a style that puts people in the fear mode. And so they leverage this fear of missing out. They leverage fight or flight mindset, which is, as I said, if you don't perform well, you're going to lose something. And that's very wrong, because if you keep people in a constant state of fear over time, one of two things happen. They either leave because their unhappiness drives them to leave, or they become numb to the fear. The brain could only stay stressed for so long, and after a while you get into the sublime state where you stop caring. And if you look at statistics around disengagement, you'd recognize it's at an all-time high, because there's just too much pressure and too much stress to perform. So when I look at performance coaching, I look at it from two perspectives. One is, what is the organization doing? And two, to incentivize or disincentivize the behaviors that they want. And two, how are you sitting in that? And three, how are you coping with it? What is your response to the organization pressure? And four, what is the way you have to adjust yourself to behave differently? Because really that's what performance is about. Getting the person to behave in a way where there is alignment between what they want to do and what the organization needs them to do. And once that's aligned, then you get the thing that needs to be done. Or as we say, you get the story that you want to be told. Yes? And so it's really about getting that alignment between what the organization wants and what the individual wants. And notice I say want and not need. And I think the misstep that we have made in the past, and that we sometimes continue to make, is that we try to define things about what is needed. And while it is true that the organization needs people to perform, and they need results, and they need money, and I, as an individual, I need a salary, and I need to feel happy and whatnot. People don't behave based on what they need, because we are irrational creatures. We are driven by what we want. And I always tell people, it doesn't matter And I've seen it where the executives don't care. You could tell them what you want. If they don't want to do it, they're not going to do it. And there are people who are prepared to take a bullet to the head and not do something. Yes. So just think of that in an organization where the drivers you have for performance is like a gun being held to people's head. After a while, they're just like, okay, just go ahead and shoot me. I don't care at this point. I am totally disengaged. So I think one of the things I try to do is to remove the fear. And that gives you the ability to become more open and receptive to thinking of other things and other ways. Because once you're in the fear mode, the only thing that you're thinking of doing is either freezing or flying. So it keeps you either stuck or looking for an avenue out, and until you get that avenue out. Without the fear, then I am receptive to new ways of thinking. I become more creative. If I'm given resources, I also become more innovative. I always say innovation is creativity funded. And you get more from the person because they want to do it. Right? The only thing I need to do is to show up for work so I can collect my salary. When I get there, I have to want to do what you want me to do so that you can get the result.
All right. Thank you so much for that. The result. And that takes us back to what you were saying before, which is about the strategy. And I remember you did say that some businesses, or actually you said many businesses do not think strategically. Okay, businesses in this case now would be many business executives, no? Because businesses are run by the executives, people that are taking decisions for the corporate body. And that sometimes they are not very strategic. Why do you say that? Why are they not strategic? What did you find as to the reason behind that?
One of the phenomena of life is complacency. And complacency happens because it's like an escape route out of fear. People want to be comfortable. It's the reason why a lot of businesses are replicative. They wait for somebody else to take the risk and try something new. And if it succeeds, then they just follow. Yeah. Strategy and strategic thinking requires you to have a certain tolerance for risk, to do something different, because there is no way you can move from who you are now to who you want to be without changing something and taking a risk. But we cannot guarantee outcomes. And so you have to have the confidence and the resources in place so that if you try something different and it fails, you have a way to recover. A lot of organizations are not prepared to do that. And because a lot of organizations still think bottom line in terms of cost, they constrain themselves as to how much risk they're prepared to take or what things they're prepared to try, because they're looking at the loss. Again, we come back to that fear that keeps them frozen. And they don't want to change. We saw that with BlackBerry. We saw that with Kodak, who invented digital cameras and then didn't use the technology. And others ran with it. Amazon, same thing. They were hired to automate, I think it was Barnes and Nobles. And then Barnes and Noble said, us too different from what we're doing and we're not going to do it. And Amazon just took the idea and went with it and then said, well, if you could sell books, then we could sell anything. And they added on to it. So there was not just the willingness to try something new, to take the risk, but also you added on now your ability to have broad perspectives because you're not operating from a point of fear. So you could see more things, you can see more uses. Apple is successful because they don't start from the technology, they start from the experience. what is changing in the world, what do people want to do, how do they want to live differently, and they try to take that story and make it, line it up with their own through technology. And so I think of strategy as not just being able to think critically, but also to think laterally. You really have to be able to think forward, sideways, upside down, back. Yeah. And to be willing to think of things that you could not even imagine. We have a thing called black swans, right? And the crisis in the energy market. I worked for a long time in the energy sector. Trinidad survived three black swans moments, and in fact, our affluence came from being able to capitalize on a black swan, which was the energy crisis in the 70s. Yeah, the only company that survived that was Shell, because they actually had a scenario that envisioned the onset of a cartel. What if a group of suppliers decided to work together to manipulate the cost of oil on the market? And the people who were big in the world, they say, well, that will never happen, right? This is how we do business. Nobody's going to do something different. But yet it happened. And I think if you really are able to think strategically, you are able to, and willing and unafraid to imagine what could go wrong in the world. Not just when I'm planning, but in the world itself. What happens if all of our customers decide to leave for some reason? You don't need to know the reason. You just have to imagine if that is the case. How do we respond to that?
I mean, based on that, would you make that assumption, that analysis, that when you decide that is going to, of course, influence your decision, what you do, of course, put resources behind that, and you are not sure 100% that is going to be the case?
You see, when you have the comfort of knowing that if I fail, I can recover, aren't you going to be more open to trying it? You have to take, those stories where you have multiple endings. It depends on what decision you take. So you can create the ending that it is not the author who decides the ending, it's the reader. Those adventure books that use
that is one of the stories. Yeah.
That is what strategy is. The ending is not known from the beginning. It's not a straight line to a particular defined point. If you are doing strategy and you're thinking strategically, you would have thought of multiple stories from different perspectives, and that gives you the options. And so if you go in knowing that I can try and fail, but if I fail, this is how I'm going to recover. Even though it's not a perfect scenario, it's not a perfect projection, you still have a place to start from, something to fall back on. You don't fall flat on the ground, you fall with a little onto a cushion that helps you bounce back. Once you have that safety net in place, you go forward brave. And I think this is why you need to open strategy up from not just the owner of the business or a few executives, but incorporate your whole organization. Because people have different perspectives. And that's where you get the black swans, because black swans are not, as we tend to think of black swans as phenomena occurring that we could never have imagined. And we assume that means that it didn't exist, but it's not that it didn't exist, it's just that we didn't see it. And so if you look at any black swan event, and from after it occurred, you will be able to see that there were lots of things telling us this thing was going to happen. But because we did not have a story that connected those particular, we can anticipate that it was going to happen. But if you ask those broad questions, and I actually have a methodology that I use, I don't know if you're familiar with, the psychology tool called the Johari window.
Yeah, please share with us. We are interested in that technique.
Yeah. And so the original tool, the Johari window, uses 4 quadrants. It's what you know and everybody knows about you. It's open. It's known to all. There's a quadrant where there are things that you know, only you know and nobody else knows. There's a quadrant of where there are things that people know about you that you are not aware of yourself. And then there's a quadrant where nobody knows. That quadrant, that 4th quadrant where nobody knows, is what I call your black swan area. But like I said, black swans are in fact predictable. And so if you look at the sweep of what we all know, what we know and others don't, and what others know about us but we don't, and you take that information, it can give you a cue to start imagining what could go sideways. And those sideways things are what will create a black swan, the unknown unknowns, right? So I call it your known knowns, your known, like I said, known by itself but not by others, and known by others not by self, and then the unknowns. If you try to ask these broad, and this is where some of that coaching happens, right? If you're a strategic coach now and you're working with a team, those are the questions I will ask. Well, let's try to expand. What would happen if all your customers disappeared? What would happen if the material or the resource or whatever it is you're relying on, you no longer have access to it? What would happen if there's a war? What would happen if a new coalition would appear? Okay, relative to your market, right? What would happen if a new player enters the market? Now, and these questions that we would typically ask randomly. So why can't we do it upfront when we are creating the strategy? And we have a sense of where we want to go, ask those pointed questions. That kind of hints to a scenario where if things go totally sideways and the world shifts in a way beyond how we currently know it, how are we going to respond? If you have the stats of those stories captured in your black box, what you have then is your alternative plans, your strategic scenarios. A lot of the times when people think strategic scenarios, they stick to the world that they already know, and they don't go beyond what they don't know because they think, well, it's not going to happen, or we are too complacent to say, well, I have enough money so I could survive it. So it doesn't, and that's not always the case, as we've seen time and time again.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. Now, I don't have a question, and because this question is related to what you were discussing before, I think actually in the beginning, it had to do with the identity. Now,
Yes.
So I'm sort of wondering, what role does identity play if maybe you are in this line now that is fine line on where you are creating the reality for yourself? But I think also again, this is the power of story, that what you are creating doesn't exist anyway. It exists only in you, and it exists only potentially. But you are bold enough to bring it to reality, that you can manifest it by your action.
Yes.
A very easy way to understand it would be when we developed the airplane, the aeroplane, because the aeroplane is something that
Yes.
was developed only recently. It was not here in our history. We didn't have it. If you need to move
Yes.
from one place to the other, even before the car was designed, you need to take the horse, or you need to literally walk.
Yes.
Then somebody said, I'm going to design a car. But what is a car? Somebody need to have the idea, and from the idea, we bring it down. You don't know whether it's going to work because it have never happened before, but you are bold enough to try it. This is why I believe that it is said that the people that can change the world are those who are crazy enough to believe that they can do it. Because if you believe that you can do it, then you can do it. Okay, I know that the line that I'm trading here is very fine and is also very important. I'm talking
Yes.
about us moving across the known, the law, what we already know, inventing something new. And we need to really be very bold to do that, knowing also that we can also be wrong. I
Yes.
think when we get to this point, what is the role of knowing who we are, our identity, our message, our story, what we want to represent in the world? What
Yes.
does this mean? How does it influence that decision, that line where we are?
Well, I think it gives you courage, the courage of your convictions. And so if you are sure of who you are and what impact you want to have, you're not going to let somebody else redefine that for you. Yes? And so you have those people who are driven by the power of their imagination, those in the creatives. The I don't want to use the word innovators. I want to say the creatives. Okay? I have a very specific definition of innovation. It's creativity funded. I think if you are creative and you can tell your story compellingly enough, you get somebody else to buy into your wild imaginations, into your dream, and you present yourself with such a strong identity that people want to be aligned to it. Yes, they're gonna fund your dreams. Once you get your dreams, your creativity, your creative ideas funded, then you can become innovative because now you have the resources to make it happen. Yeah, but it comes back to the strength, the certainty, the centeredness of your identity. You can't compel somebody if you yourself are in flux. But if you stand firm with a certainty, this is who I am, this is what I can do, and you tell that in a compelling way, people will believe you and they will follow you and they will fund you.
This part is important. This part we are now, because we are talking
Yeah.
of people having the confidence to do this. Because now I'm talking of you now looking at a virgin land. It's probably swamp. And you tell somebody in this swamp that is going to be a 10-story building. The picture is clear in your head. And if you are crazy enough, people will come to believe you. And
Yes.
it will one day become a reality. You need
Yes.
a lot of courage to do that. You need a lot of confidence to do that, because you need
Yes.
to tell people that that thing that you don't see, it can come to be. And if you are
Yes.
crazy enough to stand by that invisibility, by that thing that people cannot see, very soon it will become real. Now, you see,
Yes.
I told you that I'm creating a signature program about the topic of owning your story. Because
Yes.
this is literally you say that this is what it is. And if you can
Yes.
stand by that, that is what it really will be.
Yes.
I believe that the hardest thing for us is not to do it, is to believe that we can do it. Because if
Yes.
we believe that we can do it, the how to do it will emerge. All right.
Yes.
Tell me, as a coach, the importance of that in what we are talking about here.
So I want to suggest that um, you don't want to become so firm in who you are in owning your story that you become blind to other stories, including the stories of how other people see you. Um, no man is an island, and we to succeed we have to be able to connect. And one big thing you want to be sure of is at your core what your principles are, what your values are, but you also have to know what your boundaries are and how flexible those are. If you have very inflexible boundaries, and you're operating in a space with a lot of pressure, that's highly in flux, um, you may think that you're holding firm, but all those pressures, all those conflicts and dissonance coming at you cracks the shell. And eventually, or creating a vibration that your insides fall apart and you don't know. So you have to have an awareness of how strong those boundaries are around who you define yourself as, what your story is, what are the parameters. So you protect to a certain extent, but you also leave room for some permeation. Yes, you don't want to have impermeable barriers that you become fixed and unchanging in the world. Nobody will succeed over time. We've seen businesses fail because of that mindset that this is who we are and this is who we'll always be. You know people like that, where this is who I am. I'm not going to take feedback, right? They don't perform well. They get left behind. So I think know what your values are, what your core principles are, know where your boundaries, know how flexible those boundaries are so that you could coexist in the world. I think if you fail to absorb any of the environment, any of the other stories, any of the feedbacks, we are unable to make connections with others. We are unable to become unrelatable to others. We become seen as inflexible and difficult to deal with, and therefore nobody wants to be with you. And so if you have a strong story, but you're seen as immovable and inflexible, unrelatable, you aren't able to make connections, and who are you going to compel? I think the trick is to be able to connect your story to someone else's, but still keep that unique point because you know what your values are, and do a little bit of negotiation. So you find that point where you lock with somebody else's story and you make the connections that help you bridge the world. And that gets you from point A to point B.
Thank you so much for that, Antonia. You see, that description that you are giving is to the mature mind. Because
Yes.
now you are telling the person that you are going to say yes, but you're also going to say no.
Yes.
Now you are is that you're going to be a chameleon, but be too much of a chameleon, meaning that you don't have a name, meaning that you are nobody. But you're also going to have a name in that you have something that you are defending. If that thing that you are defending is too strong that you don't want to bend, you are going to break.
That's right.
It is said in my language, south of Nigeria, which is Esan, south of Nigeria, that Udo awogbe oki tubo va. Let me explain what I mean. That if a stone actually, not a rock, but also it can also be translated to be a rock. If a rock is too hard and it cannot be broken by external forces, it will be broken by internal forces. Which means that if you are too strong, that nothing can happen to you, you will literally kill yourself. So now, yeah. So now we are trailing a line that is it's a fine line. And many people can really sort of get some complexity there. In that, what is going to define what's going to define the point? I will say, okay, yes, at this point, I'm going to change. Because if you are changing all the time, meaning you are not really built on a solid foundation. But if your foundation is the only thing that is going to work, nothing else is going to work with you, you are also going to fail. I know you already explained it, but I want you to spend some time more on that.
So change can occur in two ways. It could be incremental or it could be disruptive. I know the thing now is about disruptive change and disruptive innovation, but you don't need to be radically different to transform. You could change incrementally. We transform from a baby into an adult incrementally. You don't just wake up and you're an adult, right? and so it's the same with your personality or your strategy. You have to know what your values are, principles are, and how you display that, how it's received by others. So how well is your story being received and understood by others? Are people interested in listening? If people are still listening and you're taking feedback, you're going to have incremental change, right? You're going to adapt to, okay, well, we understand you want to be blue, but this blue is too bright, so you subtly change it. Yeah. When you're listening to the feedback, if you're opening yourself to that and you're staying connected, at some point you're going to hear or recognize when people stop listening, when your story is no longer of interest. And that is the point where you have to ask yourself, do I need to find a different audience to listen to this story? Do I tell the same story in a different, or do I tell a different story? Sorry, the same story place, or do I tell a different story altogether? And that's going to be, do we adapt to the environment, or do we transform ourselves to be different so that we can still continue in the environment?
All right. Now, people that have listened to you to this point in the conversation, they want to learn more about you. Perhaps they want to do business with you. So tell them, how can
Yes.
they reach you? What is the best way to learn about you?
Well, you can find some of my stories online on www.definitive, definitive, definitive.tt.com. Or you can visit my personal profile, Antonia Ferrier on LinkedIn. I only carry my business persona on LinkedIn. On Facebook, I exist in a private sense because that's my other self. So people who see me on Facebook say, "Oh, you're so funny. I didn't know you were like this." Business persona is different. I have a work persona versus my actual self. So I have space online. So if you're looking for me online, social media, look for me on LinkedIn, and you're going to see what I'm about. Both as a company, you could look for Definitive Management Solutions, or my personal page, Antonia Ferrier on LinkedIn. And of course, I'm sure you're going to share in your below your podcast my email. Yes.
Yeah, of course. If you want, then if you put it, then be ready to receive the the messages that are coming.
And so you can email me, reach out to me. So right now, that's where I appear the most on LinkedIn. I have to change the story on my website, but the foundation is there. So you get a sense of what I do. And of course, there are little video clips and blogs about me. You could just Google Antonia Ferrier and you're going to see some of those published stories and videos about me appearing online. So you get a sense of who I am. But right now, your best bet, reach out to me via LinkedIn and let's connect.
Lovely, lovely. So, Antonia, what would be your final thought here to conclude this conversation? This has really been a very rich sharing and deep dive into conversation. Of course, this is what we do here. We don't do a 2 minutes or 5 minutes episode. We really go deep dive into it because we want people to understand. So how would you like to conclude it?
Know what is the story you want to tell and why.
All right. That is short and it's really precise and powerful. Thank you so much, Antonia, and I appreciate the time and the sharing here. This is valuable. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me and sharing your own story with me.
Thank you.